if Ilhan Omar said something like that, or any left-wing so-called comedian said that, conservatives will be all over it. And so I think that's the problem with me. It's the selective snowflakeness of both sides when it comes to the issue, and they don't actually care about anti-Semitism itself. They care about using that as a weapon against their enemy. And if it's your side, they don't really care.
Welcome back to
Ami's House.
We are joined today by political commentator Ian Haworth. Welcome to Ami's House. Ian, good to have you.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I know we've been trying to set this up for a little while, so excited to be here.
Very excited to have you. Let's start right off the bat with some of the breaking news. You're a fellow traveler, a proud Jew, have some exciting news overseas for justice, I would say, on behalf of Israel and the Israeli people. Ismail Haniyeh has been assassinated. Any initial thoughts, reactions after? I opened Twitter last night, and we're in a time now where things are kind of stranger than fiction. It feels very cinematic in terms of the sense of justice, where the figurehead of Hamas for so many years, if you've been following Israel way before October 7th, has been this face, one of two, really, him and Khaled Mashal. So what are your initial thoughts when you see a headline like that?
Yeah, I mean, the more terrorists dead, the better, right? This is just something that we should all objectively be celebrating. The guy is responsible for not only Jewish deaths, Israeli deaths, but American deaths as well. I think it's tantamount to what Israel and Jews on the world stage have become. You know, we're not just the dog to be kicked around anymore. There are actually consequences to kicking us around. There's nowhere in the world that's safe to hide. I think the fact this happened in Iran is kind of a massive statement too, because you basically can't mess around and just get away with it anymore. And I think it's wonderful. I think the people who are actually responsible for October 7th facing consequences is always a good thing. I think it says a lot about perhaps American politics, the way a lot of these people go without facing any consequences for decades, and then Israel gets on the case and it's a little quicker. And also a couple of other things. One, amazing for the meme game. I mean, just seeing what on the internet is just exploding. Like, this is a great time for the internet. And also, like, prayers up for people like, Ilhan Omar, Rashida Tlaib, Jeremy Corbyn, of course, who lost a dear friend. And I think so we've got to make sure we set some time aside for them. It's a hard time for everyone. Some people love these terrorists, and it's a hard day for them.
Yeah, go ahead.
Have you heard anything about the logistics of it, how it happened?
No, I haven't. All I've seen is a lot of winking emojis and a winking meme. Like, I posted one. I don't think Israel at this point have even, taken credit for it. It's obviously Israel, right? Unless the guy fell down some steps in the middle of the night. It's obviously Israel. But again, like, a lot of the strength comes from not admitting it. And so just to see them all scrambling over, to see like Hamas and Iran threatening more, like, this is an escalation. And you're seeing some people in the Biden administration kind of hinting at, this might be an escalation. They were way past that. We're decades, if not centuries, past that. And so, great to see.
It'd be funny if Bibi just released a selfie and he was just like, wink. The one thing he didn't say during his speech to Congress was "fuck around and find out." But he's implying all that. Yeah, it's really interesting also to see that, like, events like this really draw out the true colors of the opponents of Israel, because the whole time they've been saying how, there's this distinction to be made between people who full on support Hamas and want Israel destroyed. You have those people out there, but then you have people who are like trying to be fine-tuned critical, like they shouldn't be doing indiscriminate bombing. There's too much collateral damage. Yeah, maybe Israel has the right to, but not like this. And then this happens exactly in the way some of those people say it should, and they're just like, and you see people like Sean King and
famous white man Sean King.
Oh my God! Yeah, I saw what you wrote there. Like, what was the tweet you just said? Somebody wrote about it. You saw his
white people are the worst.
White people are the worst. You know who Sean King is?
I actually don't.
Look him up. You'll see what he's talking about. But he basically saying, like, it brings out the true colors of sympathy and solidarity for Hamas, in that what Israel is actually facing and what the supporters of Israel and the Jewish community and the Zionist community is facing is not just a disagreement on policy or critiques of Israeli military or government policy. We're facing support for we're facing people who support monsters. And they come out in droves now, either in their support and solidarity with Hamas or their deafening silence in the events like this. Like you mentioned, these politicians or whatever who say nothing,
Yeah, I think it's always just stunning the way nothing is ever good enough, right? Like, going in with airstrikes isn't good enough. Going in with actual human beings putting Israeli lives at risk isn't good enough. Precision strikes that take out nothing but the bad guys aren't good enough. It's almost like they don't want Jews defending themselves. I think that's the ultimate conclusion here, is that nothing Jews will ever be good enough. it's really like the center of the double standard, which is how I approach everything to do with anti-Semitism. Is there is no answer that is good enough because they don't want an answer. They miss the days where Jews would just sit there and get rounded up into camps and gassed with no ability to defend themselves. Mm-hmm. And now that there are not only Israeli Jews, but American Jews who have the ability to defend themselves, they really don't like it because a fair fight, it's not quite the same.
Yeah. What do you think motivates that at the various levels where the problem is just that Jews are still here and we still exist at its core, like it's lip service to say you can defend yourself, but not like this, not like this, not like this, right? If it's an airstrike with collateral damage, that's wrong. If it's precision, then you were aggressive on sovereign territory and invaded other people's, and then you're like responsible for the retaliatory attacks of your enemies because you were the ones who escalated. So it's a lose-lose. But
do you really feel like people want to see Jews gassed?
I think some people do, for sure.
Yeah,
I think I'm very careful with how I talk about anti-Semitism because I always think there's at least two different camps, right? And I think there are people out there who genuinely want all Jews to be killed. I think we're seeing some of them on American streets today, marching around, quite openly calling for Jews to be killed, that Hitler was right, et cetera, et cetera. A lot of those people are also, ironically, the people who say that the Holocaust is made up. The Holocaust was great, but also totally made up. Right. I also think there's a lot of just ignorant people who are really the useful idiots. And we've seen that throughout history. People who don't really openly or knowingly hate Jews, but just go along with it because they've fallen into whatever the trap of the latest anti-Semitism is. So if you look at contemporary anti-Semitism, which is anti-Israel anti-Semitism, it's really nothing to do with Israel, right? It's all to do with hating Jews just through a different lens, which happens to be Israel this time. And so a lot of people will just go along with it thinking, Israel is a rich Western country. Palestinians are not. Israelis are white. Palestinians are brown. They're looking at it through different lens and just skipping the thought process, skipping the history, skipping the context. And then, of course, it doesn't help when you have supposedly intellectual people like John Oliver coming out and comparing what's going on in the West Bank to the Holocaust. But because he's British and he makes funny faces and occasionally says the F word in a silly accent, he must be right. And, being British and therefore correct is my thing.
You're immune to that. We're under his spell still.
Well, we have the Jon Stewart, who's our Jew, who's like, Well, I find that the real clear distinction between the left-wing anti-Semitism and the right-wing, which I want to talk about, is like specifically on the right, is the implicit and the explicit, because the left wing has this core value of anti-racism, so they can't explicitly be anti-Semitic. It has to be couched in a sort of anti-colonialist narrative. But on the far right, which has been this weird ascendant thing, especially in the response to wokeness and the reactionary right that we're seeing, where, under the crusade of anti-cancel culture and free speech, we're going to say the most provocative, abhorrent things we can say, which is about Jews, because those are the group, that's the group now that's front and center, and we're going to make Israel the persona non grata enemy number one, public enemy number one. But I'm seeing it on the far right where you're finding this explicit anti-Semitism. What's your take on that and how representative it is? Because at one point during the Trump era, first term, a lot of people on the left were very happy to condemn anti-Semitism when it comes from the white supremacist ilk. And I always thought, that's marginal. Charlottesville, those aren't good people, obviously. They're not fine people on both sides. But those people are pretty marginal. They're not representative in the culture. But sadly, post-October 7th, I've been seeing, and I've been avoiding naming names for a while, but after an event like last night, Jackson Hinkle getting out there on Twitter, expressing solidarity with Hamas and rest in peace Khania and the American Communist Party, but America first, and Jake Shields and these folks who are and Nick Fuentes types, they're gaining this popularity of this edgy new frontier that is really, really disturbing to me as a Jew. And I'm curious what your take on that is of the far right ascendance.
Yeah, it's kind of a lot to unpack there. I think one is it's nothing new. It's just it appears new, right? I think social media provides us with a window into things that were already there. They were just happening in the shadows and didn't get quite the same momentum that they do today. There's a lot of monetization aspects to this, where if you've got something really this is a problem on X and Twitter, I'm ruthlessly free speech, right? I think all these people, including Nick Fuentes, who I think is a piece of shit, have a right to be on social media and a right to share all their horrible ideas, as long as they're legal and that they don't actively incite violence, things like that. But the thing is, there is a downside to that, which is, especially when it's monetized, you have people who are incentivized to share the kind of content that gets attention. And you see this from a lot of people who I don't actually think actively hate Jews. They're just jumping on this bandwagon of this stuff is pretty popular. It's almost like I'm not allowed to say it culturally, so I'll go ahead and say it. Therefore, it's correct. And there's a lot of illogical steps you've just completely leapt over. And so I think you're right in that obviously far-right anti-Semitism is a problem. It's been a problem for decades, if not longer, but it's part of a broad spectrum of anti-Semitism that people don't want to address. This has been my criticism of Republicans, Democrats, everyone left, right, center, is that people only care about anti-Semitism in a broad sense when it is a way for them to actually attack the other side. So, for example, in 2018 is the first time I became openly politically active is after the Pittsburgh synagogue shooting. Obviously, that was a white supremacist shooting. And so you had the entire left coming out in droves condemning anti-Semitism. But what they were doing is they were condemning far-right anti-Semitism because you have black anti-Semitism. They don't care. You have Muslim anti-Semitism. They don't care. You have far-left, communist, Marxist, whatever you want to call it, anti-Semitism. They don't care. They have general academic anti-Israel anti-Semitism. They do not care. But the same is true of the right, is that everyone is all over Ilhan Omar, Rashida Tlaib. Ilhan Omar can't go outside and eat a bagel without someone talking about how it's somehow anti-Semitic.
But then cultural appropriation if she did that. Cultural appropriation if she ate a bagel.
It turns to ash in her mouth.
Yeah.
But anyone on quote-unquote our side does the same thing.
Some people did something with cream cheese. Yeah. Oh, my God.
That's real hypnosis right there.
Yeah. Oh, my God.
But it's people on our side, quote-unquote our side, or anyone who's close to our side, they do something that Ilhan Omar would do, and it's crickets, or it's dismissing it, or it's somehow defending it. I'm not just talking about Kanye West, who's the obvious example. I'm talking about someone like Tucker Carlson, for example, who dismisses what's going on in Israel's, it's just a foreign conflict, why should we care? And then he's jet-setting off to every country you can possibly name. You've got Joe Rogan, who I think is wonderful. Joe Rogan has done a lot for the free speech movement, for the libertarian movement. His show is obviously great for just conversations, but saying things like, Jews love money like Italians love pizza. One, not particularly funny. I think there are far better Jewish jokes out there. But two, if Ilhan Omar said something like that, or any left-wing so-called comedian said that, conservatives will be all over it. And so I think that's the problem with me. It's the selective snowflakeness of both sides when it comes to the issue, and they don't actually care about anti-Semitism itself. They care about using that as a weapon against their enemy. And if it's your side, they don't really care.
So to clarify on the Joe Rogan example, because I remember people, you're saying you're not criticizing Joe Rogan in that instance. You're saying the people who react to that are not doing it for genuine purposes of combating anti-Semitism, because whether they care if it comes, they're using it as a weapon to just go after a Joe Rogan or go after those who follow him and to say, you see, this, your figurehead must be smeared and invalidated because of some silly joke.
Yeah, I think two things, right? One, I think what Joe Rogan said, he has every right to say. I don't think it's correct. There are plenty of poor Jews who are not into money. It's also hilarious. He got paid hundreds of $millions to a podcast. He clearly loves money and he's not Jewish. How does that possibly work? But he was also speaking in the context of talking about Israel and talking about anti-Semitism. He was talking with someone who was actively, in the moment, defending Ilhan Omar for anti-Semitism. So that matters, right? It wasn't like you and I just talking about bagels and one of us makes a Jewish joke. They were actually talking about anti-Semitism. So that matters. I don't think he should be cancelled. I don't think that means he's anti-Semitic. It was a throwaway comment. It was a joke, right?
Right.
But then my issue comes is I want people to be consistent. If you're actually anti-Semitism, that has to include when it's people who are on your side, or you really want to go on Joe Rogan's show. Because a lot of people, I would love to go on Joe Rogan's show. I probably never will. It doesn't matter too much to me. But I'm going to
after this episode, Ian.
Who knows?
A stepping stone.
Who knows?
Tell Renan's joke. Renan's joke about Rogan.
Yeah, we had a comedian friend of mine named Renan Hirschberg who said he makes this joke where he's like, I just think Joe Rogan is bad for society. He's just bad for society. I just think he is. The only way I would ever go on his show is if he asked me. If him or anyone from his team responded to my many emails, I would go on. Well, I think the fundamental difference there is that the sense of it's not the comments that people make, it's who's making the comments. And there's a subjectivity to it. Because if we trust that Joe Rogan, who has a history of being open and inclusive of everybody, has all different kinds of voices on his show and is just a genuinely curious person. So he has somebody on whom, like an Abby Martin, but then he also has Coleman Hughes, and he sort of reflects the curious ignorance of a situation to be open to ideas, meaning there's not much of an agenda there, which I think is why he's so successful. And he's a comedian, then there is a truth that he's making, and I don't think he's thinking as much about the sensitivity of the context of somebody who's talking about Ilhan Omar. He's just saying, I know that to be true because in comedic circles, we make those stereotypical jokes all the time. So he's sort of relaying that sentiment. if Ilhan Omar is making comments about Jews and money, it does not come from a good place. It comes from a more malicious place with malicious intention. So I think for a lot of people, you know, it's sort of like when your best friend calls you something versus when an enemy calls you something.
Yes.
It's the same statement, but it means very different things depending on who it comes from because of the trust factor. And we do not trust a Rashida and an Ilhad when they talk about Israel and Jews because I think their motivations are questionable at best, right?
And I think the context of that conversation is why I brought it up. Right, I don't really care that Joe Rogan makes jokes about anyone because I don't care about really what any comedian says about Jews. Like their purpose is to make people laugh. I don't really care how you do that. If you care about free speech, you can't be overly sensitive and laugh at fat jokes, but then not laugh at Jewish jokes, right? I think the problem that for me is that it came in the context of someone defending Ilhan Omar's comments about Jewish gold and AIPAC being motivated by money, and the response to that was, "Well, yeah, Jews love money, obviously." Like that's the issue, is because if you're a comedian and you're making jokes, fine, I do not care. But there's a strange thing going on, more on the right and the left, of comedians hopping between comedy and political commentary. I don't think Joe Rogan is necessarily doing this, but we're seeing it on a broader level where you kind of get away with both, right? I can say something false, I'm just joking. Then I can say something that's not funny, I'm a commentator. And I think that's the issue for me, is like, how do we judge those people, right? Because if your only purpose is to make me laugh, great, make me laugh. But if suddenly you're someone like Stephen Colbert, who's for some reason dancing with Chuck Schumer, and then the second he's not funny, it's like, oh yeah, but I'm making a broader point. It's like, no, your broader purpose is to make me laugh. That's it. Otherwise, shut up.
I mean, that's a topic that endlessly frustrates me. And, you know, it's not even just the Jon Stewarts and John Olivers and the late night hosts now. Even podcasters who have no expertise in anything, you know, they'll talk very, very seriously and very in depth about topics they have no idea about, and then when they get called out, they're, well, I'm just a podcaster.
Just asking questions.
Yeah. I think since October 7th, the stock of podcasters commenting on world events has gone way down for me. Like, I mean, to me, it was really illuminating how much some of these people I really relied on for my commentary really know nothing about anything, and they never have.
Yeah, it's very eye-opening when you listen to a lot of these people. There's one is, if you're entertaining, that's often seen as a proxy for knowledge or understanding. Kind of the same what I said about John Oliver. He's British, therefore people think he's smart. It's like, trust me, there are some really dumb British people out there. But just make a funny face, you get away with anything. But it's like, just because someone's entertaining or funny doesn't make them correct. And that's the big thing, is that we just see these, it's kind of the morphing of political space and the celebrity space, is we just assume someone's famous, assume someone has a platform, and we just assume good faith, which I think we should do. But if someone is showing you over and over again that they're acting in bad faith, and you keep allowing them to hide behind the good faith nonsense, I think that's when the consumer needs to be waking up and actually thinking, do I put trust in this person? Or do I at least still engage with their content, but through a lens that actually understands they may be talking out of their ass on this topic or many topics?
Yeah. So how do you draw the distinction between commentators and journalists? I mean, you spoke about this you were on the Rubin Report, reflecting on conversations that I had when I spoke to Candace about Israel, and it sort of revealed that there's a problem that goes on both sides of the aisle in the commentator class, where we now have, you have podcasters who are just talking about anything, but people who specifically in the political or cultural space having takes on things. There's such a wide array of authority that people have on particular issues, but you have to talk every day and give your take. So what, in your mind, is the difference between the commentator and the journalist, and what responsibilities relatively do they have to their audience?
Well, I think the journalist is a rapidly shrinking category of people. Whereas now journalism means you have a Twitter account and you simply repost what's going viral on Twitter. That is not journalism. That is not a journalist. I think there are a handful of journalists still out there who are motivated by just uncovering the truth, right? They're not motivated by a narrative. They're not motivated by their own bias. It's just, this is happening, I'm going to go find out the truth. That's what journalism should be. And now it's become anyone with thumbs and a phone is a journalist. Like, people call me a journalist all the time, and I take them up and like, I am not a journalist. I sit there and I tell you what I think about something that's going on. I also try and do what too few people do, is admit when I don't know something, and I'll go away and look it up. This happens when I go to college campuses. Hopefully not too often, but if someone asks me a question and I simply don't know enough about the question, I will tell them I don't know. But that's something that you do not see in the commentary class, is that not knowing is a sign of weakness, and you have to have an opinion, and you have to have an opinion now. And that's the big problem, is you see people jumping on every single issue. Journalism has to be now. That's another problem. But if you're a commentator, you're pretending to be a journalist. You're taking someone else's so-called facts and you're just spewing it out as your own. and usually plugging the gaps of ignorance with paper while you're doing it. I think commentators and journalists couldn't be more different. It's like the difference between an author and someone reading a book, right? There is no overlap except for perhaps the language they're sharing. You are not the same. And I think any commentator calling themselves a journalist because they've hastily Wikipedia'd something the night before they talk about it is not the same thing. Like, I'm not a journalist. I will never claim to be a journalist. Kind of in the same way, right? Like sometimes some of the content I put out there hopefully makes people laugh, right? I'm not a comedian. A comedian is I think one of the most difficult, if not the most difficult types of art form there is. Just because you're occasionally funny doesn't make you a comedian. And I'm not just kissing your ass right now. I honestly believe it. Yeah. But it's when people say, oh, I'm a comedian, when they make slightly funny jokes every now and again to try and hide behind the fact that they're wrong, for example. I think these categories mean something. Journalist means something. I think we need to get back to respecting true journalism, but also holding then journalists to account for not being activists, for telling the truth, and for actually going after the stories that matter.
Is the problem, though, that the commentator is calling themselves a journalist, but rather the general population is consuming commentary as journalism? And in that sense, the responsibility is different. Like I'm editorializing, I'm giving my takes, and people consume that as fact or as journalism. But I wonder if the standards need to just be more laid out and clear, especially because under the guise of it's less that commentators are calling themselves journalists, but more that journalists who are calling themselves journalists are really just narrative-driven people in the space, you know?
Yeah, and I think a lot of this also comes down to consumers are responsible for a lot of the stuff they are consuming, right? A lot of us like to look at the system we live in and blame various things. Like we don't like to blame the fact that social media has problems. We like to blame the fact that TV has problems, the kind of things that are popular. We like to blame things like TikTok. But the reality is, it's because people are willing to consume that. And I think as a society, we don't hold ourselves accountable for the stuff we consume, and yet we blame the people who are pumping out the stuff we're actively shoving down our throats. And you can't have both, right? There has to be some responsibility there.
It's a little bit, I'm pessimistic about that, though, because it is a little bit hard these days to even make a choice about what you're consuming. I mean, like, you're going against the TikTok algorithm. It's hardly a choice to stop. You know?
Well, don't use TikTok, right? One of my things is I'm actively not on TikTok. It's hard because you have to make sacrifices to some extent, right? And I understand why people are on TikTok, but again, depends on what kind of person you are, right? I'm a commentator who is pushing what I believe to be American conservative values. I care about the West. I care about not embracing the CCP and everything they're doing, and not handing them all of my data. I think it would be drastically hypocritical of me to then use TikTok for my own personal enrichment. And I see a lot of conservative commentators out there who will rail on and on about how awful China is, but then will go and use TikTok. And it's like, yes, I understand in the short term, you're reaching people, but a lot of this, I think, is actually about personal enrichment. And the fact is you can make a lot of money on TikTok, and you have to be willing, in the same way, for example, as calling out people, knowing you might not go on their show. Right, like I call out people on all sides of the political spectrum, because this isn't about necessarily getting on a show for me. But look at someone like Tucker Carlson say things that are pretty openly dodgy about Israel and therefore Jews, or he has someone like John Rich, for example, come on and bring up the Rothschilds randomly about a Bible he's talking about. We know why he's bringing up the Rothschilds. Like, come on, no one's that subtle. And I'm one of the few people who are calling it out, knowing I won't get invited on Tucker Carlson's show anymore. But I look around and I see a lot of conservatives who are just willing to look the other way because it's about their own enrichment or their own fame. And I think that's the problem, is that if you're selling ideas, if you're selling a movement, and you're selling yourself as one of the many faces of that movement, you have to live by those rules. You simply can't pick and choose the rules you want. And yes, it's a problem that how do you fix that? And I think you do it on a personal level.
Can I give both of you guys a compliment? I think something that I'm pretty new to, like, all this conservative media space, but something Ami's opened my eyes to is like the commentators with an ideology and principles and values seem to have more longevity than the ones who don't have that. I think you guys are both driven by sort of a vision you have and like real principles, which guides the choices you make. Yeah. And it's nice to see.
Thanks, Mike.
Thank you.
That's all.
This is where I immediately plug all my merch, right?
Hold up the mugs, Ian. Well, I guess that's interesting, because where do we draw the line then between areas of disagreement and like that sort of spectrum of people who are still engageable, even if they've said objectionable things? If we believe in this sort of culture that's a wider umbrella of conversation. Like, obviously, post October 7th, things were, on a personal level, to see Tucker Carlson take the stance he took in this sort of vague, like speaking out of both sides of his mouth, like, I really care about Israel. It's a great country, but I don't really care about it. Yeah. Like, what is happening? And the laugh was very disturbing. But just to be like, I'm not. If you care about Israel, you're not really an American. And I have children here, and my children are American. And for Ben Shapiro to care about Israel, he's clearly not really an American. Like all that kind of stuff. Yeah. But with time, like, so that was like really outrageous. But with time, you begin to, like, you're attributing a lot of it to people being opportunistic. But at the same time, I remember Patrick Bet-David says the Israeli wire. Clearly, we call it the Israeli wire, and like trying to wedge this issue of the Christian conservative from the Jewish conservative, and it all felt really like gross. But at the same time, if we're attributing, what do we attribute that to? Is it purely them also being opportunistic? In which case, if they're not actually being anti-Semitic in what they're doing, then it's even worse in a sense because they're just using it as an opportunity to siphon off audience. Is it purely a business decision? But then overall, at the same time, like the totality of what these people do, does it disqualify them from the realm of conversation in which maybe you said something pretty disturbing about Israel, like focusing on the Christians oppressed in the West Bank as opposed to all the Christians who've been persecuted in the region, but you choose Israel? Like, what motivates that? Is it best to engage with that to figure out what's motivating that and maybe get past it or reach some sort of better understanding, or take a more hardline approach of like, no, I'm writing you off and I don't care, I'm going to call you out? Like, what's your position on that?
I think to some extent you can do both, where I'm, for example, to focus on Tucker Carlson again, like he's done a lot of good things for our movement, right? I think he's right on a lot of things. He's obviously changed his mind on a lot of things, and people change their mind for good reasons and bad reasons. The way I usually judge that is how financially beneficial was that change of mind, right? I respect the people, for example, who come out with an opinion that doesn't benefit them immediately financially. It's like all of these influencers who are rampant communists, and then they suddenly made a lot of money as open conservatives. It's like, okay, well, then it becomes hard. Some of them might be genuine. Some of them might have just fallen into a new career that happened to make them a lot of money getting famous, which is what they wanted to do as leftists. But then there are some people who are just completely opportunistic. And it's very hard to judge between those two people just based on what they say, right? Because they might be saying the right thing, but for the wrong reasons. And I don't want to be like a purist either. So I think quite often it's a case of just watching someone over time and actually seeing, do they change their mind based on who they speak with? Because people are allowed to be wrong, right? You're allowed to be ignorant. You're allowed to say the wrong thing and not have your career destroyed. I think that's a hallmark of the left that I'm obviously opposed to. I'm not in favor of cancel culture. But in the same way, you also, if you're going to be a face of a movement, it's like people who are trying to expand the conservative tent beyond what conservatism means. If it's just all about having people on board, why don't we just endorse basically socialism for everyone, and we'll have all the socialists voting for us, and then we might win every election. Now, if you have a movement that is based on values, then at some point you have to just judge people based on the values you're pushing. Then you have to have a conversation, either is my movement changing? Am I okay with that? Do I push for the movement to change? Or do I try and change these people's minds? And I think like someone like Tucker Carlson, he's obviously open to a lot of conversations. And so I would like to think that he's perhaps open to these views. He might just be coming at something from a completely different perspective of, the America First route of I simply don't care about what happens outside of American borders, which is just historically wrong. That's blown up in people's faces quite literally time after time. But at least that's like an honest position that you can actually get to the heart of. And the only way you actually get to the root of that is by having conversations with people. There's no other way of finding out what is in someone's heart.
I guess it's there's areas within any particular movement, political movement, libertarian or conservative, where honest conservatives and honest libertarians can disagree. I guess the question is, when is it honest, right? So assessing that honesty is the tricky part, and what's motivating somebody. Is it in good faith? Because I hear what you're saying, and we also want to be careful not to use anti-Semitism as an accusation on everything that we find objectionable. Like Tucker Carlson may be wrong, and Patrick Bet-David, I thought, was his take on it was inartful. Let's be gracious there in what he was talking when he was covering the Daily Wire and the falling out. But like, I'm also not going to be quick to throw out terms like anti-Semitism, lest
it's very important.
Lose its cultural power completely, which is what the left did, and left of center Jewish community did for many, many years leading up to this.
And that's also, I'm sorry just to jump in real quick, but that's also what you see as one of the go-to defense if you are ever accused of being anti-Semitic. Because of course you say that. Like, I'm sure you get this all the time on social media. You're Jewish. Like, that's the immediate comeback. It's like, well, the problem there is that mostly secular Jews, but to some extent, some conservative Jews have used the backlash response of anti-Semitism as the shield. And so you're going to have this back and forth that both sides are wrong, overusing both that as a defense and an attack. And so I think you're completely right that we need to actually be careful, as you can be opening the door to anti-Semitism without being anti-Semitic. You can be saying anti-Jewish things without being anti-Semitic, because a lot of that is also about intent. And that's, I think, the most important thing that we miss so much in any debate is, what is your intent? What are your true views? Are you wrong, or are you knowingly pushing something that is wrong? Huge difference.
Hey guys, thanks so much for watching. If you've made it this far, we want to let you know that Ami's House is now on Patreon. We love doing extra content, bonus footage with every episode. The best way to support us is to head on over to Patreon, become a guest, and support the show for $5 a month.
If you like watching Ami cut me off, Patreon is a...
Patreon.com/Ami's House for bonus content. Thanks so much for your support, and become a guest.
Hearing you talk about people who changed their mind, I was curious what you think of J.D. Vance, or where you fall on that.
I think J.D. Vance is a politician who knows what he needs to say in the moment to get ahead. I think he's no different to any other politician. I think the strange selective worship of some politicians over others, they are in the business of saying what they need to win. And I think it's a bizarre world where we treat everyone else in our world, we kind of hold up to this authenticity line, right? We judge everyone based on what you really think. Are you a good person or a bad person? And conservative politicians, left-wing politicians, moderate politicians, they can change their mind on anything based on really where the wind is going. And we then elect them as the head of that movement. And I think it's one thing to have your mind changed, right? But I find it quite depressing, honestly, that people are that stupid as they can look at someone who thought one thing 1 second ago, the wind changes, and then they think the other. There's a huge difference between that and changing the direction of the wind. Because some politicians, very few, can do that, right? You can take an issue and you can bring it to the forefront and you can actually change people's minds on it. But the vast majority of politicians don't do that. They just lick their finger, hold it up, see which way the wind is going, and then go in that direction. And so
Where
I think
does JD fall into that category?
I think, especially given he's so early on in his political career, I think he's kind of just saying what he needs to. I think in Ohio, you need to be pretty obviously pro-Trump to have any chance of getting ahead. I think him having a history of being anti-Trump isn't exactly shocking. Almost everyone in the conservative movement at some point was anti-Trump. I'm critical of Trump all the time. I don't see that as necessarily being radically hypocritical. I think it's more you have to judge someone based on what they say and then what they do. And I don't tend to judge politicians on what they say, because usually they're just lying or they're making promises they can't possibly keep. And so I think with J.D. Vance, I'm not really concerned about what he thinks. I'm concerned about whether he actually furthers the conservative movement if, please God, Trump and Vance win in November. And so I think there's no way of knowing which camp he falls into until he has an actual chance to follow through on some of these promises, which in the world of just saying things, right, it's very easy to live in this imaginary world where you are everything at once, because you go to speak one crowd, everyone sees what they want to see in the person they're electing. I think that's why really trust in politics and the popularity of political candidates is so low right now, because everyone just sees what they want to see, regardless of how untrue it is. Right? When we had Joe Biden, he's my friendly old uncle. He's just a nice guy. He's objectively not.
Grandpa.
Trump is an everyman fighting for all of us.
I would say grandpa, not uncle at this point. Great grandpa.
Yeah, great grandpa. Where is he?
Yeah.
Who knows?
But
so I think it's a tricky one.
How's he doing?
Politicians.
Not so good.
There's a pulse. That's all I've heard.
Yeah. Well, the thing is, let's not forget, like J.D. Vance back in the day, before Trump had a presidential record to run on, a lot of people in the conservative movement, even if you weren't a never Trump conservative, maybe he fell more into that category, were skeptical of how Trump would govern as president. His conservative record was pretty strong and productive. So I think for some people who were once never Trump, they were like, look, I still can't stand by everything he said and how he behaves, but what he does is more consequential. And so I'm going to get behind that. Some people still, like a Chris Christie or whoever, maybe he has personal vendettas and other motivations, but there are people who just can't get behind the character and style. But on the substance alone, a lot of people, Ben Shapiro, people who were like in 2016, I don't know what I'm getting here because Trump was more of the populist style. You didn't know how he was going to run, but it turned out pretty conservative.
Yeah, I don't like the characterization of him as some kind of flip-flopper as much, because I think it misses the point that a lot of people in the center, me included, who thought Trump was like evil in 2014, have now kind of come around to him also. It's not so out of the ordinary for someone to have changed their mind over the last almost 10 years. And
also, that's on character too, not policy. It's on Trump's character as it holds to a policy standard.
I think one of the biggest cons in the world of political theory or actual politics, and it's been going on for centuries, is just like the idea that personality in any way matters. Right? We don't go to a dentist because he's a really fun guy. You don't go to a doctor because he just cracks you up on his, some of his off the cuff comments. For some reason, we judge politicians on everything except the stuff that matters. And so therefore we elect people who are entertaining, who are funny, who are cutting. We vote for them based on their skin color, or the fact they have a vagina or not. All these things that just do not matter, because I think to some extent people are ignorant and they've been shoved into this identity politics route. But at the same time, we don't do that with any other space. We don't really have a problem with choosing, again, like you go to the DMV, you care about whether or not they can get you the license, not how much of a good time you had in line, right? But politicians get away with it because they've sold us this bill of goods that they are there to be entertainers. They're there to be moral guides. They're there to be some kind of figurehead, fatherhead, religious figure. They're not. They're there to do a job and shut up. That's all they are. And if we judge them on that, I think we'd be happier.
In the age of television, politics is show business for ugly people. That's that's the name it's gotten, and it's become a performance game. People, every president who's won, with the exception of Biden in 2020, and we can talk about that, but every president who's won, with the exception of Biden, in the last since the 60s, has been about performance chops, not substance chops, right? They used to write in the State of the Union and submit it, and everyone would read it. Now it's all performance. I think the whole thing is where people, like we spoke about earlier, giving authority to people who can perform the best. I mean, no one really knew Obama's policy, really. He just could move a crowd and was a rhetorician better than a Romney could or a McCain, because they were stiff and they couldn't connect. Bill Clinton won the debate in 92, right, by speaking to that woman from Arkansas, looking her right in the eyes, and there was a connected moment there. So it is a performance game. Once you get into governing, then it becomes really important what you're actually going to do. But running for president is very different than being president, and running a campaign and campaigning is a very different thing. So I think that's just kind of the unavoidable nature of it. What's your take on Trump in terms of if every politician lies? You know, I've heard the description of Trump as an honest liar, obviously from people who want to try to make excuses for him and stuff. But I think there's an authenticity to Trump that is so appealing that a lot of his detractors miss. Do you have any thoughts on that in terms of when Trump is speaking, whether he's factually to the detail accurate is obviously not the case, but when he's embellishing something, and we've spoken about this before, he's embellishing something that is already emotionally resonant that he's giving something to. So what's your take on that? The type of honesty that Trump gives off that I think is missed by his detractors. Yeah,
I think the stuff we focus on, right, is that, Trump lies all the time. But again, they're often such throwaway embellishments that it's also this part of his shtick, and that he's embellishing, right? So, everything is the best ever. It's like, it's quirky. No one is actually thinking, oh my goodness, he's actually claiming that this was the best ever. Like, he's openly joked, I believe, about these kind of embellishments, right? It's part of his character, it's part of his shtick. And I think also it plays into the not giving a shit part, which is why he was so popular in 2015, 2016 and onwards, is because you have the entire left who are such purists when it comes to anything Republicans say. They will go deep into the weeds of what they're saying and nitpick the most minute detail to try and label something as false. If you look at the explosion of fact checking, and then fact checking just goes away when you have Joe Biden coming out and just openly lying about every single element of his policy. Like his State of the Union was just lie after lie after lie, lying about things like jobs, lying about foreign policy, lying about immigration. Like these kind of lies matter too. And I think people don't care about Trump's lies. I think one, because they're not as consequential, because they're throwaway part of his character, but they're so sick of being lied to. It's no surprise that people don't care. Like you cannot try and force people to care when Trump lies about the size of a rally, when you have Joe Biden looking into your face and saying that all these jobs are because of him, or that people aren't coming across the border. Or that, no, we never gave Kamala Harris any kind of authority over the border. Like when they're lying to you, to your face, when you have Pete Buttigieg going on TV every single day and just lying about stuff that's so obviously false, and you have these fact checkers in the media just nodding along, people don't care about the truth anymore. And so, of course, it's a problem that Trump lies about more consequential things, but all of this is an outcome of things. Like Trump is not really part of the problem. He's a symptom to the problem that we got with someone like Obama, who was also a celebrity president. Everything has a cause and effect, and is part of a timeline of things. And people love just to chop a moment in the timeline and blame everything that happened after on their enemy. It's simply not the world we live in.
Are you familiar with Scott Adams and his analysis of he wrote the Dilbert comic strip? He predicted Trump was going to win in 2015 when everyone thought it would be a joke. One of the things he speaks about with Trump's exaggerations is that while it's not literally true, the phrase the people who hate Trump take him literally but not seriously, and the people who love Trump take him seriously but not literally. And the idea is that there's a deeper level to it than just throwaway, in that when Trump is exaggerating something, he's hitting on an emotionally resonant truth. For instance, there were millions of people at my rallies, more than they've ever seen, folks. He's actually saying the support for me is a lot more than beneath the surface than how the media is presenting it to you. There's a groundswell of support, and we're part of this movement that's growing. Whether they misrepresent that to you or not, that's what's happening. Or when he says like just crazy things like they were cheering on, like he spoke about 9/11. We saw the crowds cheering. They saw the tapes of people cheering. Like, he didn't see that, but he's hitting on something that people felt, that there's support for this kind of terrorism that's not being addressed. In other words, so it gave me pause to think about, like, maybe there's a deeper level of what Trump is tapping into and always has been able to tap into with a broader population,
Well, that's just politics generally too, right? Is trying to tap into a sense of division, a sense of anger, a sense of hatred. That's why the left go on and on about wealth inequality, and then therefore blaming down something like racism, or blaming you not having something on someone else having something when it's not a zero-sum game. It's just all about sparking that emotional element of us, because we are emotional beings. Like, I wish we were rational, the facts over feeling stuff. But the fact is, feelings drive most people. When people go to the ballot box, they're being driven by feelings. And so the politicians who can tap into that are usually the most successful.
Right. Speaking of like media-driven enthusiasm, what's your take on the Kamala Harris portrayal as all of the sudden she is this savior, and they're doing exactly the same thing they seem to be doing when Hillary Clinton was running, where they are pretending like she is this charismatic, brilliant, messianic figure, and it's fully manufactured that, people are seeing one thing, they know they're seeing something, and then the entire media class seems to be lockstep with portraying it a certain way.
Yeah. Well, the media is the propaganda wing of the Democratic Party. Like, it's been quite obvious for a very long time at this point that to lie to your face about Kamala Harris like this is quite absurd, right? She's a terrible speaker. She's not smart. She's awkward. Like, all of these personal things that people don't like, they're not particularly important. Her policies are rampantly radical. And now they're just trying to reinvent her. I think a lot of this, though, is also to some extent an arrogance, but also an ignorance in how information works now. Because I think especially with X being under someone like Elon Musk, where sharing of information, right or wrong, is so much more free than it used to be, they don't have the grip on power they used to. So you can't shove the lie down people's throats that, no, Kamala Harris was never born a czar. When you have people immediately, not days later, immediately in the moment, debunking it. You have this sense that, they're lying to us about this, so what are they lying to us about that? And so I think a lot of it's obviously manufactured. It's shameless, really. I think the fact they think they can get away with it, though, is the story, right? It's not that they're lying. Obviously, they're lying. It's to the extent that they're lying. Like, at least Hillary Clinton had, to some extent, like a history of actual policies. She had a history of saying things. She was somewhat consistent, even though she was obviously wrong. They're trying to tell us that Kamala Harris was a moderate when 5 minutes ago she was trying to bail out people who are burning down cities. Like, it's so hilariously ridiculous, the lies they're trying to sell us. And it gives me some hope that people aren't being sold those lies straight away. And I think a lot of it is also just the desperation of where the Democrats are right now. Like, the fact is that Kamala Harris is your go-to solution to this. I mean, that says a lot about where they are as a movement. I think they thought they were going to be able to ride Joe Biden to the next election and then just get him out. And I think the fact that he fell apart on national TV, that was another lie, right? They were telling us for years that Joe Biden's totally cool. He's so sharp behind closed doors. He's running circles around these world leaders, and he can't run a circle around the buffet cart. It's absurd how old and decrepit and mentally insecure and all these things he is.
I don't think anyone's riding Joe Biden anymore. I think those days are behind him. We could talk to Jill about it, but not my business.
I got a question.
Yeah.
What do you think American policy towards Israel looks like if Kamala gets elected? How do you think that affects Israel?
And do you think it would work, this media-driven narrative of enthusiasm could get her elected?
Yeah, I mean, one, I think she could definitely get elected. I think Republicans need to be very careful to not embrace the arrogance that this is in the bag. It is not in the bag. We were saying the same things about Biden in 2020, that he's an old man who can barely swallow his own ice cream, and he got elected. I think if we're going to talk about the Israel policy, one or two things are going to happen. Either we're going to get a continuation of the Barack Obama, John Kerry, Ben Rhodes, Joe Biden idea that you can bribe people into not wanting to cut your head off, when all that gets you is rich people who still want to cut your head off. Like, that's the policy in the Middle East we've had since Obama. Obviously disastrous. The fact you got John Kerry flying around the world saying like he knows what he's doing on the world stage, ridiculous. Or we're going to have even more radicalism, and Kamala Harris is a radical. She's spoken at various Islamic groups saying that we shouldn't say things like radical Islamic terrorist, because that's what really matters here is the Islamophobia. It's like a Norm Macdonald joke. And so I think we're either going to get more of the Barack Obama stuff, or we're going to get even worse, which is an embrace of the radicalism that is fueling the anti-Semitism we're seeing worldwide and in America. And that's, I think, what people really need to wake up to is this isn't, again, to paraphrase Tucker Carlson, it's not a foreign problem. If you actually look at the embrace of these groups, the enabling of someone like Iran, places like Qatar, when you bring them into the world stage and you make them regional powers, which is exactly what Barack Obama did, they have consequences abroad, but at home too. The radicalism we're seeing on college campuses is because millions, if not billions of dollars are being flooded into campuses. We're having people imported with these views, and we're having people exporting these views across the world. But it has consequences at home too. And if you think it's going to end with people camping on college campuses screaming things, it's not. Like if you look at radical Islamism, and I talk about radical Islamism because there's a difference between people who are Muslims and the radical side of it. But radical Muslims are very open about wanting to spread radical Islam. And so they're not going to stop at having a few flags on college campuses. This is all an in for them. I think people need to wake up to that. And someone like Kamala Harris at the wheel is going to be a disaster, frankly. Like you might not like Trump in a lot of ways, but I think he's completely right when he says comments about Jews voting for Democrats are simply crazy. It's like, you are. Something that really kind of got to me is I can't remember their name, but there was one student at a college campus who kind of really blew up online speaking out against anti-Semitism on their campus. Making video after video, really standing up against anti-Semitism, which is great. Got invited to the White House, had a selfie with Joe Biden. Like, you don't have to go have a selfie with Donald Trump, but you cannot be the anti-Semitism that we're seeing on campus, which is a direct result of these foreign policy decisions, and then go have a smiling photo with the guy who made these foreign policy decisions. You cannot do that. Unless people make that connection in their head, we're just going to see more of the same or worse.
Is it worth making a distinction between opponents and enemies, or Joe Biden and, say, a squad member? Or is one just a bridge to the next?
I think we could have made that distinction in 2020. I think that's what was sold. Joe Biden was sold on, right? It's like he is the moderate amongst a horde of rampant leftists, and he is going to be the voice in the room that actually pushes against this. The problem is he governed more like Bernie Sanders, and because of him, a lot of people on the radical side got a voice, if not publicly, in terms of policy. I think that's the problem, right? Is I care about the policies. Joe Biden might say the right things about Israel every now and again, but then he'll go and build Hamas a DoorDash pier. Like, these things are important, right? I don't care what a politician says if they're handing billions of dollars to Iran, who are then sending that money to Hamas, who are then going to behead and burn Jews alive. Like, these things matter.
At least Rashida's honest, I guess, is what we're
She's
saying.
Honest. She's definitely honest.
You know what you're getting.
Well, in a way, it's like the lip service and then actions and deeds not matching your statements. Like Joe Biden sitting there saying, I am a Zionist. I'm a Zionist. I'm an Irish-American Zionist. I'm a Zionist because Israel is $500 million in fentanyl. And we reduced Medicare by $500 million for coercive visits. Israel's a Zionist. And I remember Gold in my ear. Gold in my ear gave me a lap dance. It was great. But the point is, I mean, it feels so good. I see like Democrat friends of mine and left of center Jews saying, see, we have like Kamala Harris met with Bibi and Biden sits down and says he's a Zionist. This is more like it. This is the Democratic Party I remember. But if in policy it doesn't translate, then if anything, it's worse because you buy into this delusion that puts Israel in a more precarious situation down the road because we're led to believe that these people have your best interest because they've told you that, as opposed to honest Democrats who are anti-Zionist, or Bernie, who says the problem is Netanyahu's far-right government. For some reason, he doesn't object to the furthest right governments sitting around Israel, but at least he's being honest about it. Like, so in a way, the honesty is and clarity is better than the lip service.
Well, a lot of it is just the Jewish version of Kamala Harris going to Atlanta and putting on a Southern accent out of nowhere. Yeah. Right? A lot of these is just politicians think they can just tell the right group the right thing at each point. Streets. Yeah. It's just like you can go to a bunch of Jews and just say, like, I care about Israel. I love Israel. And I'm not going to say Republicans don't do this too, because they absolutely do. I care about the policy. Right? And I do not care if Joe Biden could go on a random podcast with someone and say, I'm a Zionist. It was also funny that the person interviewing him didn't know what Zionism is. That's always like, if you're going to ask someone about Zionism, maybe Google it first. But you're not a Zionist if you're also actively funding the people trying to destroy Israel. You're not. Just wearing the T-shirt doesn't mean you're part of that group.
It's an interesting point.
Yeah. Well, you talked about Googling Zionism. Do you mind if I switch topics for 1 second? Yeah, no, as a commentator, we're talking about commentators and journalists. I'm really curious, as a commentator, how do you educate yourself? How do you do research? What do you do when you get up in the morning to educate yourself on Ismail Haniyeh and like all these topics?
Yeah, I think a lot of it is just trying to consume as much information as you can, but also always trying to kind of check yourself on the information you're consuming, right? Because we all have this inclination just to go down the rabbit hole that confirms everything we want to believe. And so I try and listen to views or read views that are contrary to mine. I try and read sources from places that aren't necessarily on foreign policy, for example. I try and read foreign sources more than I do American sources, because just a lot of American media is very biased in that way. I think a lot of it is just trying to expose yourself to other views and argue with yourself over things. So on like a high level, for example, like, why do I believe in free markets? Why do I believe in free speech? Why do I believe in gun rights? I spend a lot of the time just arguing myself. Like, do I actually believe this? Because one of two things will happen. Either I'll change my mind and I'll reach a position where I actually believe something else, which is a good thing, right? It's good to change your mind if you've reached it along a good stop, or my views get stronger. And I think that's the problem, is a lot of commentators, they don't do that. They don't argue with themselves. A lot of them just take the talking points of whatever the moment is saying, right, and then they'll just spew it out. But the second you scratch the surface, they can't even justify why they think what they think. It's one thing to be wrong if you've reached that path based on a bunch of logical steps, because at least then you can identify what step was wrong. If you just skip to the end and you're just spewing stuff out, there's no way of convincing you otherwise, because it's like your entire tree is wrong.
Yeah. There's also this thing that happens where to be intellectually curious becomes confused with being the intellectual yourself.
Yes.
So one can read a bunch of very compelling arguments, which I have. And at one point in my sort of political and ideas journey of like discovering these things and thinking about these issues, I would like have arguments with people, and I would do just that because I've just read something very compelling, and then I would try to present it as my own opinion, and I couldn't defend it. Even though I knew it was still right, it would fall flat because I didn't have the researched understanding at a deeper level to really back it up. I knew that without really, at a subconscious level, I was rehashing a compelling argument that I found, but I wasn't necessarily had put it through the ringer. And I guess there's this process that one has to go through in which an opinion becomes your own, as opposed to something that you find compelling.
Yes. And
I guess there's just an honesty one has to have with oneself, where they're like, well, I actually heard this point of view, which is really compelling, as opposed to, did you know such and such is true? Which I think the commentator class jumps to, did you know such and such? Because we all know this, right? Then presumes a common knowledge that we all have to agree on this, as opposed to keeping yourself a little bit open, which is like, that's the struggle, is keeping yourself open to be against the confirmation bias a little bit.
Also, keeping yourself open to the idea that you might not know something. I think that's something that in any area of knowledge, right? The more you learn about something, the more you don't know, right? Idiots who've taken a course, like, for example, I used to work in software engineering, right? I did computer science at Oxford in England, got a bachelor's and master's, spent 4 years doing nothing but computer science, right? And all I knew is how little I knew, because there was always more. There were always smarter people. There were always people who spent longer doing it. And then I came to the US, and one of the first jobs I got was I was interviewing candidates for other more junior software engineering roles. And I had a bunch of students who'd done one course in computer science, and they thought they knew everything. So they walked in, it's like, yeah, I'm going to be a software engineer. I did introduction to computer science. It's like, there's a huge difference. Like, the more you know about something, the more you realize there is to know. And I think a lot of the commentary class are the people who've done one course in something and then think that is the truth, or that is the complete truth, or therefore they are in any way qualified to be the mouthpiece for that truth. And I think if more commentators realize, like, use that as a stepping stone to, oh, there's even more I don't know. Like, I'm always learning. I never claim total authority on everything, because no one is a total authority.
Yeah, and I mean, there's a phenomenon that happens with first-year medical students where they start diagnosing everybody they know because they've learned a little bit of information and don't know how much they don't know, so they start saying, oh, that's this, that's this.
It's always brain cancer, by the way. If you Google it, it's just always brain cancer.
Well, in Biden's case, no, God forbid. Yeah, but that was dark.
What a segue. Dig your way out of this one.
Well, no, he needs to be diagnosed. There's something going on. But
I think he has Parkinson's. I had my grandfather had Parkinson's and had Parkinson's dementia that came out of it, and it has all the hallmarks of that, like the hands shrinking up, the way he shuffles, the
pointing, the disorientation, and it's not a derogatory thing. It's just seems like what it is.
I mean, you have a Parkinson's doctor come to you 8 times in 8 months. You know, he's not coming for the weather, right?
Right.
Why wouldn't they just say that? Like, wouldn't he look better now if they were like, listen, we got the diagnosis. Had we known this 6 months ago, we certainly wouldn't have run. But here we are. And thank you, Kamala, for stepping in, you know?
I think they would if Joe Biden would go along with it. I think Joe Biden, and also the people around him, the Jill Bidens, the Hunter Bidens, the Bidens who are making money off the Biden name, I think there's too much at stake here for them. I think if Joe Biden had a sense of humility and a sense of the actual patriotism we're told he has, we're being told he's like the second coming of George Washington or some ridiculous nonsense, this is all about him and his name and his legacy. That's why his address to the nation about why he was dropping out was about all the made up things that he'd done and why he's such a great guy and why what he's doing is defending democracy. This is all about him, right? And most politicians are narcissists. I think you have to be a deep narcissist to want to be a politician. And so I think if he was a regular person, I think that would be the thing. He probably would have admitted a diagnosis months ago, because I'm sure he's being diagnosed. Like the idea that he has the access to the best medical care in the world, and they're just like, I don't know what it is. Just pump him full of ice cream, give him some Adderall before a speech. I'm sure he's good, right? That's not the world we live in. And so I think this is all about him. I think he wanted to cling on as long as possible. I think they probably had to give him an absolute ton to force him to humiliate himself on the national TV and actually admit he's backing out. I think they probably had to pay him off. I think they had to give him the best presidential library we've ever seen. I think they're having to give him the glowing review he's getting in the media.
To step out.
Who's they?
I think it's the Democratic regime.
Mm.
I think it's the donors. I think it's the Obamas. I think it's the George Clooney's. I think it's the quote unquote deep state. I think there's always people who aren't necessarily individuals, but I think it's a group who are actually pushing for
a global
some level of establishment, right? And the Republicans have that too, right? It's become really the Trump group.
The machine.
The Trump machine runs the Republican Party, and the Obama machine runs the Democratic Party. That's just how it is now.
And what do you think Kamala has? Like, what's wrong with her?
I think she's an undiagnosed case of stupid, I think.
She gets up and drinks wine. She's like a little drunk all
wine
day.
Mom? Who said that, wine mom? That was very funny.
I just heard that too.
Yeah, it was Michael Malice.
Yeah.
Michael Malice on Rogan was like, she's a wine mom. So in the morning, it's like, oh, Joe, we did it, Joe. Listen, I'm not drunk, okay? I am altogether. We are going to talk about the passage of time.
You drive.
Passage of time. My goodness.
She's wine mom drunk. Yeah. Yeah. So we'll see what happens. But it's scary. You get this little moment of like, could it work? Could the mass manipulation and this portrayal of someone work? I don't think it can. I think they're going to do the same thing with Hillary Clinton, where the polls are showing this is showing this, and Trump's like, you all know this is a fraud, and everybody knows it. So if they play their cards right, I feel like it's not going to work. That's my hunch. That everyone is too smart, like you're saying. Everyone's like, you can't do this, and they're doubling down on the whole white men for Harris. They're like every time they lose on such a grand scale, and the DEI things start to become less popular, and people start to realize like what mistakes are being made in this like sort of wokeness. They always seem to double down on it and like re-root themselves in this whole approach of like white men for Harris, white women for Harris. It's like, ugh, don't you realize the majority of people find this whole way of categorizing yourselves and organizing yourself around these ideas so repugnant and
especially the so-called people of color that they're trying to win over. Yeah. Right, they're trying to suck at these people who just think they're ridiculous white people who are making it all about themselves. Right, that's always the hilarious thing about these white groups is that they are making an issue that is not about them, and it's making it about them. It's like the narcissism of it all.
Look at how virtuous we are. We're all white, and we're for you. Yeah. Did you see that guy sitting on MSNBC who asked like a group of black men? Now, how many of you guys supported Trump when Biden was running? Or no black women who supported Trump when Biden was running, and they all raised their hand. Since Kamala Harris has been selected, how many of you have changed your minds? And none of them. It's all everyone's still supporting Trump. Them and the black women that they knew. They were trying to ask them. Do you report support? How many of you still support Trump now that Kamala Harris is running? And they all still raise their hand.
She's also not African American, right? She's Jamaican and Indian, and I think these things actually matter. It's an outcome of the identity politics of Barack Obama. Is that everyone who is not quote unquote white is therefore part of the same category, and everyone has the same views, as if everyone who has melanin in their skin is interchangeable. I think, if you don't vote for me, you ain't black. And the Joe Biden attitude, that's how they think. They think that if you're not white... She looks the part.
And she dated Montel Williams. That's got to do something.
Did?
That's got to do something.
I didn't know that.
There's a clip of him in her in the 90s. She's got his arm like this. And
that's
they were
amazing.
Together. Montel
for VP? That could work.
It's too awkward now. Yeah, you're right. It's really that she looks the part, and they're literally just like, check. Wait, we supported the first black woman to Supreme Court, first black vice president. And I feel like there's a majority of people, black and white, of every race, creed, color, who are like, so what? Yeah. You know, what are you doing? And they seem to just double down on it. So I just don't understand this detachment from what really actually matters to people.
But it's damaging to actual progress, right? Because if you want people to have opportunities that they absolutely should if they're qualified for it, you want people being elevated to these positions because they are qualified. And the second you mention the fact that I did this because they're the first black woman, that's all people are thinking about. And for example, Kamala Harris might have been qualified for vice president, but we'll never know. She's not. But like, let's say she was. How can you possibly say this isn't a DEI hire when they are boasting that it is a DEI hire? You can't have both. If you just said, I'm picking her because of X, Y, and Z, and she happens to be a black woman, then who cares about the fact she's a black woman?
Right.
But you make that the forefront of your argument for someone, then you are damaging to everyone who is also a qualified black woman, who then everyone else thinks like, oh, did she get it because she's qualified? Did she get it because they're boasting about the fact she's a black woman? It's patronizing.
There was a great anecdote that Thomas Sowell, I was watching an interview with him where he was talking about economist, who's a black economist who was talking about the damage that affirmative action does. He was working, he's a professor of economics at Stanford, Hoover Institute, all these prominent places. But once upon a time, he was teaching a course, and a student had a question in the textbook and in the required reading, and they were asking him questions, and he gave the answer, and the student kept saying, "Are you sure?" And he's like, "Yes, I'm sure." He's like, "Are you sure though? Are you sure?" And he goes, "Yes, I'm sure." He's like, "How are you sure?" He goes, "I wrote the book." And he's like, this is what affirmative action has done. The amount of doubt that was ensued from this student to this professor, calling into question why this professor might be here, is because of all these policies that have ensured that people are getting into positions based on skin color and not based on merit, provides actually increases racism or racist thought, because it puts race at the forefront of everybody's mind in judging people, which seems to be antithetical to liberal values and principles. So the fact that they keep doubling down on it is astounding.
It also harms these communities, right? Because you're not fixing the problem. You're just trying to literally whitewash in some cases over the problem. So
you're
for
making
example,
yourself feel better about it.
It's like, for example, in the software field, you've got a lot of companies who are trying to actively hire people out of college, like based on race, for example. But then the dropout rates are very high in the same way as colleges who are trying to admit people based on race. The problem is elementary school education. The problem is STEM education in elementary school, middle school, high school. If you are not giving people the tools to actually be able to be qualified regardless of race, that's a hard problem. That's actually something that's challenging. Then you have to look at education policy. Then you have to look at corruption. Then you have to look at teachers' unions. A lot of money to be lost there. So why don't you just hire a bunch of people on the back end and then say problem solved? Of course, the problem is not solved because you're not actually equipping people with skills. You're not equipping people with the ability to stand on their own 2 feet.
It's one thing hiring a history professor for the wrong reason, but engineers, like, the bridges will collapse if you do this for the wrong reason. So STEM is pretty unforgiving, which is why I think you see such disproportionate representations among groups, because it's very performance-based. And so, like, you can't really bullshit your way through. And humanities was the first to go, but Jordan Peterson has warned, like, the hard sciences are next, man, you know, so just watch. And he's just so right. I keep bringing him up because he's predicted all these things. They're coming for STEM next in terms of DEI. And you see that all over TikTok and like the med schools and stuff. And you're just like, I want someone who's just good at medicine. And the less racist position is not to care what race they are, but to care what their qualifications are and whatnot. So anyway, any couple things. One, I want to get like required reading and any best practices for finding information. Before we finish on that, just in personal background on you and like your Jewish background and how you kind of came to be a commentator. Can I just, because we don't know each other from before this, so like, what was your like personal background, Jewish background? And I've seen you stand very strong and tweet and write about like how you never felt prouder to be a Jew in some of these moments that have happened in the past year. So just a little bit on your personal story.
Yeah, so as I mentioned, I did computer science at Oxford. I in no way political. I moved over to the Bay Area in California in 2013. I worked in a small educational software startup. Then I worked at Facebook for 4 years. And so in no way political, but kind of slowly exposed, like my now wife, for example, she grew up in like a rural part of California, so very conservative. She exposed me to a lot of these ideas that never would have been exposed to in the Bay Area, for example. So slowly over time, kind of became more enamored with American conservatism, things like the First Amendment, things like the Second Amendment, which when you're European seem absurd, right? The idea that you're allowed to have guns unless you understand the culture and the reasoning behind it seems ridiculous. And so to see that from both sides is really quite stunning. But then for me, the big tipping point was in 2018, the Pittsburgh synagogue shooting. The response to it on both sides was really floored me because you had a lot of people jumping on it because it was an opportunity just to blame Trump. But then I was looking around and like you had open anti-Semites on the walls at software companies, for example, with the American flag hijab, for example, like Linda Sarsour, rampant anti-Semite. She's a hero to them. It's like, you don't care about anti-Semitism then. This is all just a political tool. And so the first thing I ever wrote was for the Daily Wire on that topic. I wrote a column on the Pittsburgh synagogue shooting and how we need to approach anti-Semitism. We need to approach it from the position of being ready to be victimized, but not as victims. And it kind of just snowballed from there. So I talk about a lot of different issues, but at the core of it has always been trying to improve our fight against anti-Semitism. And obviously that has come to the forefront after October 7th. But it was there before, right? It's not just like anti-Semitism exploded on October 7th. It was there before. It was bubbling under the surface. It's just brought it to the forefront for a lot of people who, for understandable reasons, never needed to think about it. Yeah. And so I try and speak about it from the same position as before, which is, for me, it's not even about Israel. It's about the double standard of anti-Semitism that just happens to be attaching itself like a parasite to Israel right now. Because, like, let's say Israel wasn't in the picture. Anti-Semitism existed pre-1948, by the way. Who knew, right? And
a
Israel
shape-shifting virus. Yeah.
Exactly. And so I think that's my motivation for me, is just to try and make America what it was before for Jewish people, which is one of the few safe places on earth. And I think rapidly it's becoming more like what we're seeing in places like France and Germany right now for Jews. And that's very scary to me.
Has your Jewish life, in terms of ritual, changed at all since October 7th?
I don't think it has, particularly. I was Reform in the UK, which I guess means more conservative here, because I went to a Reform synagogue when I came to America and someone whipped out a tambourine and a guitar. I was like, no, I'm out. I can't do it. But I think for me, I think it's made me feel more connected with a history of what it means to be Jewish, and just the history of not only anti-Semitism, but I think trying to embrace the positive history that is there rather than having our entire identity defined by being victims. I think that's what I see when I hear a lot of people speak about this, is it's framing the entire meaning of what it means to be Jewish by being a victim. And I think that's something we really need to change. I think that's something that kind of sparked in my head of just, we're not victims. You can be victimized. Plenty of people are victimized, right? It's all about how you treat that and how you don't go along with it, how you don't accept it, and how you fight for the rights you are given, both by the system you live in and also by God before that. And so I think that's what really motivates me.
We had a conversation with Alex Clare a little while back, talking about, he's a singer-songwriter, producer, and an artist who talked about like kind of the culture of the UK when you're growing up there as sort of a minority. There is this sort of general British culture is about not being sort of out front and center and proud and having that sort of confidence in who you are and where you come from. I'm curious, one, what was it like to grow up in that way? How did you feel as a Jew in the UK? And what do you think about in terms of the prospects for the Jewish community in the UK today?
I think the prospects aren't good, because I think they're just a few years behind what we're seeing in places like France and Germany, where you have rampant immigration, completely uncontrolled immigration with no protection of culture and no pride in culture. And so you have cultures that come in that are consuming the culture that was there before. And so I don't think the UK is going to get a safer place for Jews. I think for a variety of reasons. I think there's also Jewish naivety there, that things are just going to be fine. Like if you just read through Jewish history, things are not fine unless you make them fine, and you actively make them fine on a day-to-day basis. And so I think you still have a lot of Jews there who kind of have not to compare the two, like this is a pre-Holocaust moment, but have the same arrogance in the 1920s and even the early 1930s of, oh, I'm sure it won't get that bad. Like if we just keep our heads down, it'll be fine. And I think that's where some American Jews, but all Israeli Jews are very different, is that no, you can actually stand up in favor of what you believe. I don't think things in the UK will change. My experience there was very much of, I was bullied a lot for being Jewish when I was younger. I was also a very different personality than I am now in terms of how I handled that. You know, I was very timid, very quiet, to some extent let a lot of it happen to me. But again, a lot of that is a decision. I think that's something that comes with experience and comes with age to some extent, but also how you approach people doing bad things and saying bad things is completely up to you. And it doesn't matter what bad things are happening, you can still decide how you approach that. And so I look at the UK right now, and I think there are a lot of Jews I wish would embrace that more, because it's only getting worse, right? There was anti-Semitism growing up, just by nature of the fact that there are so few Jews in the UK compared to even the US, but also culturally, Judaism isn't part of British culture like it is American culture. I think at least secular Jewish culture is part of American culture. You cannot deny that. You go to places like New York and in California, it's just there. It's built into to the brick in many ways.
You don't say the word shtick. You don't hear shtick and chutzpah on the streets of the UK.
You definitely do not. Similar things, but not quite. But it's sad to see. But I think a lot of it, again, is you don't have to make the UK like the US. You don't have to make Jewish culture central to what British culture is. But I think you have to stand up for Western culture and understand that Jews are only safe if I think we make it safe for ourselves, because there's this strange to some extent weakness, to some extent arrogance, to some extent naivety, that other people are going to fight our battles for us. I think that's what Israel has taught us, is that they are not, right? Unless you fight the battles for you, like you may skirt along for decades, if not centuries, of having the country you're in. For example, George Washington's letter to the Rhode Island Jewish congregation, absolutely stunning thing to be written in the 1700s. That's a rarity among millions, if not billions, of people who either don't care about Jews or actively want to see them destroyed. And so I think we need to be taking responsibility for ourselves on any level you can, whether that be embracing the Second Amendment, learning self-defense, being a vocal proponent for Judaism and just the right to be Jewish and not be ashamed of it. There's so much we can do, and I want to see more of that.
And on an optimistic note, Sam Harris was interviewed, I forget in which setting it was, but he said that there's this difference between the warped reality of social media that paints a certain picture versus what's actually going on. And he said that, you get a sense on Twitter when you're doom scrolling that, oh my God, everyone hates Jews, everyone hates Israel, it's over, TikTok, 50-50, it's increasing support for Hamas. But then you poll like 70% of Americans who are like in favor of Israel and said they should destroy Hamas and do whatever they have to do. And there's this silent majority that may not know how to articulate their solidarity or support for the Jewish community or for Israel, but it's there, and we shouldn't be naive to it and take it for granted, but it's there. So there's encouragement in that, especially in the United States.
I mean, I travel the country all the time, as I know you do, and I see Israel flags all over the place, especially in places you wouldn't expect them to be, right? I go through rural Tennessee and people are flying Israel flags. Oh, nice. That's the reality of America, right? But for me, again, I want it to be about more than just Israel. I want it to be about American Jews. And I think that's the problem, is quite often people just talk about Israel as if that's the be all and end all. It's part of the problem, certainly. But if we just solve the problem in Israel, whatever that means, domestic anti-Semitism is still a thing that we have to be concerned about. And I think for a lot of conservatives, they need to broaden their scope of what this means and actually focus on American Jews being part of the conservative movement, not just, I wave an Israel flag, I put an Israel flag on my lapel, therefore I'm good. It needs to be more than just that.
You're about actions more than words, and we appreciate that. Ian, thanks so much for talking to us. This was a really great conversation. And where can people find you?
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. It was a pleasure. You can find me on all social media, IGHAWORTH. You can find me on X, Instagram, Facebook. Please check out my Substack as well, and you can either subscribe to me there for free, or you can support my work as an independent content creator by subscribing to one of the paid levels there. But any support would be wonderful. Reach out to me if you have any questions. I just want to try and change people's minds. That's all I'm trying to do.
But that's a lot of reading, right?
A lot of reading, I'm afraid. Yeah, there's some videos there too if you're less of a reader.
If you could audiobook it or clip it for me, I'd really, really
Not our audience, Ian.
Well, Michael's a better reader than I am. But anyway, it was great schmoozing with you, Ian, and keep up the good work out there. Really appreciate it.
Thanks for making time for us today.
Thanks for having me.